Thank you, Naomi. That was incredibly powerful storytelling. And we're going to invite a panel to sit with you to explore the role of community-embedded place-based services in responding to disasters. And of course, that starts with that word we've heard a lot of, listening to local voices and building on local social infrastructure. And the panel's going to explore building support for communities and working cooperatively to put local recovery back on track. So we're going to invite Rosanna Barbero, who's the CEO of Addison Road Community Centre, which I know quite well because pretty much every elbow positive ad was filmed there. Pauline Cook, CEO of Monaro Family in Monaro. I should know it's Monaro because I did that by election too. Monaro Family Support Service. Liz Mackinlay, CEO of Australian Business Volunteers, and Naomi. I'm going to ask you guys just to try and keep to 3 or 4 minutes with your responses. You will have a chance at the end of the panel to have final comments again, but just so we can get through it all. Rosanna, we're going to start with you. During the lockdowns in Sydney, particularly while international students were surrounded without support, you mobilised a civilian army in the inner west to respond to the critical need for food aid. You drew on all your experiences in international aid to make it work, and I know that Addison Road also has a program where you have, I think it's almost expired food. You've got like a community, almost supermarket thing happening there as well. How did you mobilise all that to work in 2020 and 2021?
So again, being place-based, and I'll keep concentrating on that, so being at the grassroots level and and keeping an eye on what was happening, and we knew something was going to happen. In fact, we were quite prepared, not thinking we'd have a pandemic, but even having solar panels and other things in place. And we were able to use our warehouse, a big community hall that's usually used for community and cultural activities. And overnight, in the first week of March, we were able to turn that into a warehouse and started to just ring around and mobilise all the food distributors, because we anticipated that something would happen and fundamentally people would need food at a time like that. Again, we didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but we knew that we needed to be prepared for the worst, so we set up our warehouse. What was different to my past experience was it was a pandemic. We were asked to social distance as well. So we had to set up the whole infrastructure that we had to set it up so when the civil army was mobilised that they would be safe and able to come. So the community felt safe to come, and the volunteers felt safe to come, and the other local organisations and other civil society organisations felt safe to come. So we had to work out a system, including arrows and signage and tables, basically a Ford production line with arrows and crosses that...
You're quite lucky in that, unlike a lot of spaces, you actually have space.
Indeed. And so we had 9 acres. Our hall was 1,000 square metres. We already had operating food pantries. We already had a relationship with food banks, so we were able to buy in supplies very early. We anticipated that we would have to box items, so we got everything together. But I think what was really important was that even all the local organisations, and we go back to trust, knowing your community, having a relationship with your community, knowing every member in that community, who's vulnerable, even knowing people's pets and the needs of their pets, which came in handy, by the way, and I'll tell that story later if I've got time. But it's really everyone coming together and knowing their community. And I know that Lisa's here from Roselle Neighbourhood Centre. All the neighbourhood centres and community centres came together. And, we talked amongst each other. How do we help each other? Who's doing what? Who's better placed to do different things? And so then we also had lots of people coming into Addison Road that had a big voice and a big platform already, and they were able to call. Remember, it was a time when all the sporting community couldn't play ball games anymore. And so we had people amongst us that were able to make a call out to all of these young, fit, healthy people. I mean, foreign correspondents that couldn't report overseas, they all came. Everybody used their networks and skills, as you said, the emails, but everyone's sending it out to really mobilise people power. So we had a lot of sweat equity. People brought their cars and they brought their bodies for labour. They brought a whole range of things. And so we were able to move really quickly. And as we were moving, things were changing. The more that, you know, the food is a communication tool. It communicates, we are here, we care, we are in solidarity with you, we're not abandoning you, are you okay? And that's how we found out other needs that people were facing. And including legal, and I really have to say this because I am with my colleagues too, and Vasily from the Marrickville Legal Centre. I mean, during that time, with all the international students, which really there were thousands coming to Addie Road, lost their jobs overnight, didn't know whether their visas, they were asked to pay an enormous amount of money to buy these visas. They didn't have places to stay. They were basically, we were ready to set up a refugee camp actually at Addie Road to house a lot of these students. A lot of them weren't paid what they were supposed to get paid, and so we had lawyers talking to them, and one lawyer at Marrickville Legal Centre was able over a whole period of the COVID, the worst of the COVID, to get back $2 million. That's extraordinary in unpaid employment benefits. You know, and yeah, so that's incredible. And then there were other things like kids from culturally and diverse backgrounds that didn't have access to IT. Their parents didn't know how to connect them or even to help them with their schoolwork. A lot of them refugees who had been in the country only for a short period of time. Often one mobile phone and 4 children. And so we were finding out this simply by this a civil army delivering hampers, talking to people, other community organisations talking to us, telling us what was going on. And those needs, and I really want to stress this, change all the time, which is why listening is really important. Because what is relevant today and what people need, it can change very rapidly next week. Particularly, I'll just put on this point, vaccines, understanding about the vaccines, the fear around vaccines. I mean, we were dealing with people from at least 56 different language groups, just even that understanding. So it was really that mobilisation of everybody coming together, organisations, and I will say neighbourhood centres and community centres, because they were the ones that were agile. They were the ones that were facing the anxiety, the fear of the people. That people weren't knocking at the ivory towers of the big organisations. They're our people, our community, you know, coming to us, knocking on our doors, needing help and support.
So I think the lesson though for governments then is that the stronger your community centre is in good times, the more they are ready to prepare when things go bad. And I think sometimes governments don't think about those organisations until it's a bad time and they rely on them, and we need to sort of let them know, just like Addison Road is uniquely set up compared to so many, and they need to make sure there's Addison Roads everywhere because things will go wrong.
Exactly, and I've always said that you have to be prepared, you have to plan, be prepared, respond, and then manage, because there's all that post-disaster as well. And there was no government really. They were absent. I don't know where the hell they were. But
it's because it wasn't a competition or a race.
Yeah, and philanthropy, I mean, a lot of our volunteers had connections to companies and philanthropists, But, you know, I'd really like to see a time when the bloody Defence Department go to the philanthropists for support,
yes.
and our government put their money into institutions of public good.
So that's a good time now to move on to Pauline, because she's working in the Monaro area, where people are still waiting, where people are still living in caravans from the 2019-2020 bushfires, and absolutely relying on the community because government hasn't stepped in. So Pauline, you talk about being part of the invisible infrastructure that makes communities tick. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, thanks. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of this country that we meet on today, and to Naomi too for sharing that deeply powerful story to kick us off. And it's a privilege to be sitting alongside you. Yes, the invisible infrastructure. So Monaro Family Support is another of these organisations that we've been hearing a lot about today. We have been around for 50 years. We were built from the ground up by members of our community, and we are proudly place-based. And I like to think about the invisible infrastructure that we've been talking about as kind of like the mental load of parenting. It's built on all of that knowledge and the relationships that you have of your family, but it's very difficult to quantify, and often it's not seen by government and funding bodies. We have 50 years of working with our local community to deal with life challenges. So when the fires came along, we knew exactly what to do. We didn't wait, we stepped right in. We have an intimate knowledge of our local communities and local context in all their diversity and their difficulties and their difference and their detail. We have really deep and wide networks with the local stakeholders and community champions. We have a really substantial footprint. So we actually are on the ground, unlike many organisations who are funded to deliver services but are not present. I'll never forget some of the services that came in during the fires, and there were many, saying that they would go out and deliver services. Of course, COVID came along then, and there were some impediments to delivering face-to-face services. But in an area where we have very little internet, and people said that they desperately needed face-to-face services, some of these external organisations said, no, we've got telehealth, we don't do driveways. We don't do driveways. And we are an organisation that do driveways, we do cattle yards, we do community centres, park benches, verandas, whatever it takes and wherever it takes to meet the needs of our community. Our team are actually of and from the community too, so they are based right through a really remote regional area, and we go from the Victorian border to Kosciuszko National Park up to closer to Canberra. We're extremely flexible. We always find a way to meet the needs of our community, and the solutions that we deliver and that we offer are devised in mutual exchange with our community. Some examples of the programs that we have run and that we still run today that demonstrate this flexibility. We have a rural men's program, and this is called Around the Campfire. So we sit and we don't mention the word mental health, but that is the substance of the program, but it is offered in a way that enables men to connect in a rural setting. Recognising that our community don't want parenting programs, and that their overwhelm levels are so high that they can't take in those structured educational programs anymore. We deliver programs in front of a horse, so using equine assisted learning modalities to try and strengthen those relationships instead. We don't sit people in a room and push out parenting messages. We have a tracks program for our Aboriginal community, which was funded by DCJ to improve literacy and numeracy of our Aboriginal young people. Well, we said those young people, we know that those young people won't learn unless they have a strong connection to culture. And our Aboriginal community said, that's what we want. We want opportunities. In our area, Narragansett people were pushed away from their traditional lands to the coast, and so it was very difficult for those young people to access meaningful opportunities to learn. So that's what we worked on. We're accessible. We always get help in a timely manner to where it is needed, and we have real people, and we go to where people are, as I said. We understand the trauma of our community. We see patterns of intergenerational risk and vulnerability, and we know who those people are. So when it came to the fire, we were able to harness and mobilise so rapidly. Like Naomi said, you know, it was months and months until other services got on the ground, and we were already there doing the work in a very sharp response time. And in a disaster, you don't have time. The time is acute, and the need is now. We were also able to fold the support into the activities that we already offered, so it was a holistic offering that we had. And we were able to provide that emotional support to our community members because we care for our community. They are our friends, our family and our neighbours. But what we also saw was as the circus coming to town. So this was when we became aware that there was vast amounts of money being handed out to somewhere, not to us. And the larger actors came into our area kind of peddling their wares. And I'd really like to point out that on the whole, these organisations had no authority or acceptance by the local community. They had none of the things that I've just mentioned of the elements of that invisible infrastructure that's so important and so critical to getting help where it is needed. And we heard earlier that nothing for us without us is a really critical tenet, but we also felt that without us there would have been nothing. So it was that facilitation piece that was reliant on us as the place-based service to actually open the doors for all of these bigger players, the external organisations who were funded to come in and actually to duplicate what was already taking place on the ground. So we tirelessly reflected the needs of our community and spoke to these external actors. What I'd like to point out here is that I feel that the time has come for that arrangement to change. We would never go into an international aid and development context and not look to our NGOs to have some kind of meaningful partnership framework with the local organisations, and they have to have that. In fact, DFAT require it as part of their accreditation process. You have to demonstrate that you are partnering with local organisations, building their capacity, working with them, and that can take all kinds of forms. It could be as little as an MOU to a formal arrangement, transactional arrangement for delivery of services. But we didn't see that here. I guess for us, we felt like we talked ourselves hoarse about the importance of listening to community during that time. We lobbied MPs, we spoke at the Royal Commission, we did research projects, we're still doing research projects. We backed funding bodies into the wall and said, how come you signed off on community-led disaster funding when all you did was speak to someone who may have been, I don't know, a teacher in a school who said, oh yeah, we had been there for a few months and said, yep, we need more wellbeing programs, when actually that's what we already do. And we called for asset mapping to be current and to reflect the strengths and the local assets that are in communities. But, you know, it went nowhere. It was all the busy work that we heard about early this morning. So I guess, and it was like, you know, acupuncture gone wrong. It was like death by 1,000 needles for us as we were there, also supporting our community, also living through fires ourselves, with fires burning on our own rural properties. So I guess one of the things, our pressure point, what we have decided to do is to put all that aside. I mean, some of it is still going on, but to try and remedy the situation, we have created a place-based alliance with similar like organisations that do know their community, that understand trauma, and we can become a trusted voice. We can put funded consortium applications in for funding and try and turn this thing around.
And so you need to be part of, like the engagement with that group needs to be an immediate sort of part of the process each time, and the sort of the first point of call almost.
Yeah, so we are the go-to and it is recognised. But we can't wait because we really had to elbow our way.
I think the alliance thing is a great idea because it almost formalises it, and then they know who to go to, because I think half the time politicians don't know who to talk to, which is, part of the problem. But that sounds like great stuff what you're doing. Right, Liz. Now, Australian business volunteers, you'd think, a couple of years ago it was going to poor countries and helping them, and then all of a sudden it's Australian business volunteers in Australia. I know that you're meeting with Senator Tony Sheldon tomorrow, and so I'm interested, who is the Special Envoy for disaster recovery, so I'm interested to hear about what your key messages are. But how do you make sure that organisations who want to be seen to be doing good aren't just in the way?
Look, it's a great question, and it is such a privilege to be on this panel with these three extraordinary women. I was sitting I'm just going to tell you a story. I was sitting at dinner with my aunt in Yass about a week after the fire went through Cobargo, the Black Summer Fire. And we were talking about how devastating it was and how terrible the Prime Minister and that awful trying to shake the hand of one of the community members, and Danielle from the Relief Centre was yelling at him, and she had the goat, and it...
I may have used that in an ad once.
Yeah, right. Well, and I said to my aunt, look, there's going to be people mobilising. There are going to be people mobilising to do response. But in about 6 to 8 months' time, they're going to be buggered. The community members are going to be absolutely knackered, as Naomi said. And the kind of sexy nature of it is over. The community is left there trying to rebuild, trying to recover. We're not a service delivery agency at all. We're an international development agency, as Dee said. And I just was watching what was going on, thinking, where are the international disaster recovery principles? I've worked in international development for 25 years. I couldn't work out why Australia wasn't applying do no harm, don't displace the local organisations, work with the local social capacity, be trauma-informed. And it turns out her friend runs the Celtic Festival in Yass, and she said, well, I know Zena Armstrong. She's the president of the Cobargo Folk Festival. I'll give you an introduction when you're ready. And so about 7 months after the fires, I was introduced, and Zena said exactly what Pauline said. She said, now listen, who are you people? What, you're coming down from Sydney. And I was like, well, I grew up in Toowoomba, so I'm not really a Sydney person. And we got to talking, and I said, look, you guys are doing this on your own. You're exhausted. How can we help? And our ethos, I guess, is we say to the communities we go to, you are the head and the heart in this scenario. You know what you need, and you've got the passion for it, but you're tired. So how can I help you? And we mobilise highly skilled volunteers to come around the services that already exist. So if it's to do grant applications to rebuild and get some of that money, we do that. If it's to mentor the local businesses who are trying to recover, but the insurance is prohibitive and they don't know if they can adapt their business model, and particularly through COVID, then I'll find a business mentor. If it's to help work out pre-feasibility for infrastructure rebuild because the only road in and out of the community got washed away, and it was never actually an approved road anyway, so how are we going to navigate council? I'll bring infrastructure experts, I'll bring advocates, people that have done DAs, and they're all volunteers. So I'm not bringing a bunch of consultants, I'm bringing people that have a heart to walk alongside the community and do what the community wants. We've been able, and that's resonating. that's resonating with communities. And you all work in communities and you know how tired organisations are of being displaced, of being run over, of not being listened to. And so that's what we do. We just come along in a very trauma-informed way and say, how can we help? I've had a couple of calls from a few people from Lismore in the last week, because we're not there to hand out food or make sure basic needs are met. We're actually there when the resilience and the recovery building has to start.
And what are the key messages that you're going to give to Tony Sheldon?
Well, it's that. It's this, communities know what they want to do. Yep. You don't need to put out another grant round that says, we have a solution for you. And I had a senior bureaucrat say to me at the Australian Institute of Disaster Recovery Conference, oh, I know what we need to do now. We need to focus on mental health. And I thought, no. What you need to do is listen to community, listen to these services and the providers that are there, and just humbly walk in and say, what do you need? And how can we provide flexible funding around that so that you as a community are empowered and supported? I've got two quick messages before I stop. One is community-led is amazing. I've worked as a community mobiliser around the world. I've done it here in Australia. But not funding community-led is a crime. You have to fund it. It doesn't displace community voices, it doesn't displace community leaders, but expecting someone that's lost their home, lost their business, is trying to recover themselves and who has genuinely stood up to be a community leader, to do that without any support is criminal. I had one woman in community say, I'm sick and tired of these recovery officers showing up, because they stand there and they cross their arms and go, well, we've got to be community led. We're just gonna watch you do it. Appalling. And my second one is that communities adapt and change. And we do have a business focus. We work with not-for-profits and community recovery groups, but in these small communities and in some of the bigger communities like Lismore, if we don't support the businesses to recover and work with insurance companies and banks about how to change the prohibitive economic environment they're in, to get insurance in the main street of Lismore for anybody is $40,000 a year entry level. Yep. How do you run a business if you've got a $40,000 insurance bill? Yeah. You can't. And so we have chronic insurance across Australia, which then means that vulnerable places, vulnerable businesses are actually, what they're going to end up doing is they're going to pack up and they're going to go. Yeah, right. And that is the death knell for a community. If you don't have viable businesses, if you don't have a post office, food, grocery, your garage, your plumbers, then you're not viable. So we're different in what we do, but I think it's the same message. You have to listen and you have to empower. And governments, if they don't change the grant rules and this ridiculous competitive grant rounds, and then none of this is going to work.
And also a lot of people just don't know how to fill out grants. There's an art to it. To have someone come in and do it for you, I could imagine would take a weight off.
And it's hard because we don't have I have no skin in the game about what any of the communities want to apply for. That's great. There's still effort. We'll have grant writers there helping, but it's still taking time to get that thinking and that, what is our business model going to be for this facility we're going to have? So we advocate a fair bit to government on behalf of the sector and communities because it's not okay, and we can do better.
Yep. Now, quickly, we're just going to go around, but I'm going to start with Naomi, but the others, I'm just going to ask you, if you had sort of one kind of small thing that governments could do to support and mobilise invisible infrastructure, what would it be? But I'm going to start with Naomi first, particularly when it comes to making sure Aboriginal communities and organisations are at the table.
I was just going to say, you're asking that question firstly to the Aboriginal person sitting on the panel.
Yeah. You probably know better than us.
Look, I just want to acknowledge the commentary because, it's so important, hearing this, but it's also extremely frustrating, that like I said, we're an Indigenous newspaper. I've predominantly worked in the Indigenous media sector. We just fell into this. And, the past 8 months has certainly opened our eyes to the frustrations that lay within your sectors and within the work that you do. So I think the biggest responsibility that we've acknowledged as an Indigenous media organisation, certainly as individuals that work within Indigenous media on a national platform, is making sure that we're telling these stories, making sure that we're sharing the stories of our communities that are going through the most traumatic times of their lives, making sure that we're listening to our community members, that have that knowledge, that knew long ago that there was a reason why certain vegetation lined our river systems to prevent flooding. That these Indigenous knowledges are so crucial and important to how we prevent natural disasters in the future. We're doing the work. We're advocating, we're fighting to get these messages across. The most frustrating part is that even at a local level, our voices aren't being heard. And I can say this because our local council, I feel, has a lot of work to do to listen to the local communities. I'm embarrassed that our local council, that I'm part of a region that is led by this council, still aren't making decisions over the past 8 months that are absolutely vital for how people see themselves in their ability to truly recover from what's happening. The politics of it all is disgusting. I think what we need is leadership to make quick decisions and to take action quickly. Unfortunately, that's falling on the backs of our community organisations and members of the community. We have the ideas, we have the knowledge, and we certainly know how to change these systems and frameworks that have never served any one person, in this country, except for those that are sitting in those positions. And I speak about this really passionately because as an Indigenous person, there is very little faith and trust that any kind of formalised structure, and we talk about hierarchy and title and system and framework, that needs to be built around the voices of our community members will happen. And unfortunately, we walk away from gatherings like this knowing that we still have much more work to do. I think locally, and certainly as a group of people at the Koori Male Flood Hub, our job now is to make sure that we're creating these systems and frameworks ourselves, that we're doing our own work in that capacity. As an example, creating a First Nations first responders team, so that in the event that this happens again, we have our local men and women that have stood by our side for the past 18 months, that now have the opportunity, by the amazing support of Fire and Rescue in our region, to be mentored and supported by Fire and Rescue to receive the basic training, just like any other SES volunteer or worker would receive, to make sure that in the event this happens again, we know exactly where we need to go to provide support, rescue and relief and recovery to our Indigenous communities, because we found that they severely got left behind during this Lismore flood, and that I can confidently say that if it wasn't the work of our people on Bunjalung country up there, our organisations, our local community groups and our local mob, and mob coming from all over, that certainly would have been a different story for a lot of them out there.
Thank you, Naomi.
Yeah.
Now we'll just move on to Rosanna. If you had one thing that you reckon...
Yeah, well, one thing, but I'll say it in 2 lots. So, and I'll be very brief and very quick. So you're asking me about the response, which is, the preparedness, and I think that every community should have a disaster preparedness and response hub, or whatever we want to call it, so they can quickly move into mobilisation and receive the capacity building and the tools, and because the infrastructure does exist. So that's one part of it. The other thing that needs to happen is that we know this is happening because of climate change. We know it's happening because of neoliberal capitalist programs. We know why this is happening, and that we also need simultaneously to address the causes. And that is equally as important, because otherwise we're always going to respond to inequality, housing crisis, floods and fires, and we're always in response mode, getting more and more exhausted. We need to be looking at what's causing it. We need to address that, and if that means changing our government, overthrowing our government, banding together, mobilising, changing those funding models, being extremely impolite and demanding change, then I guess that's what we need to do.
I'm not going to advocate overthrowing the government, but I do think, not this one yet, but yeah, it's 97%.
Causes.
97% of our disaster recovery fund goes to post-disaster fixing up instead of pre-disaster mitigation, and that is a fucking shame. Okay, quick comment from you.
Yeah, look, I think disasters are coming thick and fast and they're not going to stop. So we are pursuing our own strategy, which is this place-based alliance, so that we can be better situated next time around and during the preparedness, the ongoing preparedness work that we're currently doing. But I think also there is an onus on the bigger, larger external players to make sure that they have meaningful partnership arrangements in place before there is any funding handed out, and that should be a criteria of funding from government.
Yep. Liz?
Yeah, look, I think community-led is the structural issue that departments don't change the rules or their staffing or how they do what they do is going to keep crippling good response, right? You can't just rebadge someone as a recovery officer and not give them skills, and you can't just say, yes, well, we understand and we're giving out money for disasters, whether you're regional New South Wales or Victoria or whatever, without actually changing your policy environment, right? Because these are just people trying to do their jobs, right? They're just trying to do their jobs, but they won't change how they give grants. They won't change the policy environment. They won't actually implement the National Action Plan, and they won't retrain staff to actually be able to understand exactly what the three women on this panel are saying. So that's the structural stuff's got to change.
Excellent. Okay, well, on that note, we need to do better and change things. I'm going to say it's afternoon tea time. It is 3:10, so you were going to be back at 3:20, but let's...